Hello, I'm the Dark Master, and in today's video, we shall be continuing the Kirby Right Back at You retrospective, this time covering episode 56, Dedede's Pet Threat, or as it's known in the Japanese original, Selfish Pet Scarfy. This episode was originally released on November 9th, 2002 as the 56th episode, whereas in the English dub it was released in November 22nd, 2003, also as the 56th episode. Wow, this is the third episode in a row to not be rearranged. In fact, in order to decrease repetition, let me just say the series luckily avoided any further release scheduling issues until episode 94, so hooray for 4Kids finally getting their crud together and not rearranging things in such a silly manner for pretty much the remainder of this series. But enough of this pre-review trivia. Let's start with the episode proper, if you will. The episode opens to the insides of the king's throne room, where we see King Dedede and Escargoon looking as a delivery is delivered via the monster teleportation service, as we see boxes marked with the enemy logo. These amaze the king, as we then see a cage containing the monster/characters of the week, these being the Scarfies. Since they're introduced right here, let's go ahead and discuss them and talk about them since they're, immediately relevant now. Scarfies are these cute little animal heads that have been part of Kirby's Rogue Gallery since the very first game, which I've reviewed, so go check that out, where they are one of the few enemies that can't be inhaled by Kirby, which admittedly is a rather fascinating gameplay concept, but as we shall see, it doesn't quite translate all that well. They don't really have voice actors and instead make generic cat-like sounds, which is fine given their design is that of a floating cat head. Overall, in terms of design, they perfectly transitioned into the anime well, and we see King Dedede open the cage and just be automatically in love with them as they greatly please him with their adorableness. The enemy's sales guy asks if they're cute and says that they're best pet that one can get. And the king is just absolutely and utterly enthralled by them, snuggling up with them. Escargoon is skeptical and says that they look like trouble to him, to which one of the Scarfies bites at him. We also see the first change between versions here. In the Japanese original, he comments on how they kinda look like Kirby, which causes Scarfy to bite at him. Indeed, a lot of comparisons between Kirby and Scarfy are made, especially in the first half of the episode in the Japanese original. Even the sounds of Scarfies are slightly altered in sound, and they sound more like Kirby initially, at least. The English dub for some reason removed all these comparisons, and I'm not quite sure why, as they seemed a fairly unoffensive thing to just remove or change. The king dismisses Escargoon, saying they won't be any issue at all, and the enemy sales guy explains to the king that every pet has special needs, and as a pack-in bonus, they are giving him boxes and boxes of specialty food for them for free. To which Escargoon calls him out, as given the price of the Scarfies themselves, the fact that they're giving him free food isn't really all that of a gift. Fed up with his petulance, the Scarfies lunge at Escargoon, scaring the goober away. The enemy sales guy then explains that they are very loyal to their masters, and Dedede laughs and says if they're nice to him, it's alright, and they all cuddle up together as we go to the jazzy intro. After this jazzy intro, we see the king sitting on his throne, petting his four Scarfies. They seem to be hungry, and the enthralled pet owner decides it's feeding time. Escargoon asks him how many of these boxes that they got that he wants, but the king says that he won't feed his pets such corporate slop, and instead decides to call upon his Waddle Dee servants, who bring an absolutely giant cake to spoil his new pets. Interestingly, this large cake uses the exact same design for the cake that was seen in episode 51, Kirby Takes the Cake. One of those neat cameos that you might not notice, but it's actually kind of interesting, frankly, that they reuse that design. But I guess it kind of makes sense. There's no reason to throw it away. The Scarfies are overjoyed with glee and launch upon the cake, which then collapses upon poor Waddle-Doo, as Escargoon gets drenched with their food leftovers as the four Scarfies ravenously consume the cake messily. Escargoon says they need some table manners, and they look full as Dedede calls them over, and they all snuggle together, as Dedede loves them even more. We then cut to Cappy Town, where we see King Dedede taking them for a walk. Their strange appearance causes people to stare as Tuff looks at them and asks what are those things. His sister says she has no idea as the king approaches them. Dedede then introduces the Scarfies to the concept of Cappies as we see the next change between versions. In the Japanese original, Chief Bookham says they look like Kirby, which Tiff agrees with. In the English dub, he instead asks, "What does the king got there?" while Tiff says they're creepy. Kirby approaches the Scarfies curiously, but Dedede tells him to stay back, threatening Kirby with imprisonment, or in the Japanese original, he outright invokes the death penalty, which was sadly removed by 4Kids due to being a reference to death, and they wanted to protect all those innocent children. People are shocked by the name Scarfy, and Tiff asks if they're monsters, to which King takes great offense at, saying that they are his little babies and are not monsters. And Escargoon clarifies that Scarfy is the rarest, most exotic pets on the planet. We then hear Mayor Len Blustergas driving by in his old-fashioned car as a curious Scarfy goes towards it and experiences a vehicular accident, much to the horror of the king, who complains about him hitting his innocent pet. The mayor points out that the pet jumped into his car, but the king ignores this objective evidence and calls upon his guards to lock him up, with the Japanese original having the tyrant demand that he get a sentence of 20,000 years of manual labor for his unlawful driving, while the English dub doesn't give him a specific time for unknown reasons. Chief Bookums in both versions, however, calms down the situation by pointing out that Scarfy is not hurt at all, and the charges are dropped by the king. Tuff offers him some candy to make the pet feel better. The king takes offense to his offering and says that his pet won't be eating no junk food, and takes him away. We then cut to Kawasaki's restaurant, where we see the usual censorship of the kanji on his blue flags being airbrushed out by 4Kids in the English dub for reasons that are never really explained. Going inside, Escargoon orders everything on Kawasaki's menu, but the cook hesitates, much to the king's chagrin, as he explains that pets are usually not allowed to eat in the building. The king yells at him that he will allow them to eat, and so Kawasaki relents, and we see the Scarfies absolutely scarfing down their food, as we see another change between versions here. In the Japanese original, this scene has a minor key version of the invincibility candy theme. It sounds genuinely good. Sadly, due to 4Kids' incompetence when it came to getting the licensing rights to the music of the TV show, it was removed, which just goes to show how incompetent 4Kids is. Returning to the plot, we see Kawasaki no longer really upset at the pets, as he appreciates them on how much they enjoy his food and give him money. We then see the Scarfies stuffing their faces. Despite this, King Dedede just finds things just to be so adorable, and he even brushes plates onto the ground, likely breaking them. We then cut to Tiff and Tuff commentating on the situation, as Tuff says that those Scarfies must be starving to eat that much of Kawasaki's notably terrible food. Tiff says they can eat anything, with Tuff saying that They eat almost as much as Kirby, but then Tiff notices Kirby is gone and is shocked when they see Kirby has wandered over to them, and when a piece of food falls near him, he goes to try and eat it, but then a Scarfy bites him on the arm. Kirby struggles to get it off, and the king is greatly concerned, separates the two, victim blames Kirby, then tosses him over to the kids, and he's left with a pretty bad scar. I mean, ugh, that looks painful, much to Tiff's chagrin. The Scarfy who bit him then creepily licks its lips as though it enjoyed the flavor. We then cut to that night at Tiff's family room, where she and her family are about to have a nice dinner made by Ladylike, but before they could enjoy it, the four Scarfies barge into the room and messily consume the food right off the table, and everyone is powerless to do anything before they then leave floating away. Tiff and Tuff decide to follow after them, thinking the king must not be feeding them as much, and they follow them to the king's room. They are shocked, however, to see the king spoiling them with a whole turkey. Tiff asks aloud, how is it possible that they could still be so hungry after eating so much so recently? And we see the king baby his pets. One of the Scarfies tries a cupcake and hates it, which makes sense given that they are inspired by cats, which the king then gives to the mortified escargoon to finish them. And despite being pressured into it, he's actually relieved when it doesn't taste that bad and the saliva is barely there. Tuff comments that the king is surprisingly taking good care of the Scarfies, but Tiff laments that he's just spoiling them rotten. We then cut to that night as we see the king has already taken numerous photos and gotten them framed and everything. We see that the king is sleepy and watching some home videos that he somehow managed to record earlier. The king then says, somehow not being satisfied, that he wishes that they were watching stuff with him instead of napping, and ponders if maybe he should get yet another pet, like a puppy dog or fish. We also see another change between versions, as in the Japanese original, that book has the word catalog on its cover, while the English dub for some reason saw fit to airbrush it out for some silly reason that seems completely pointless. Escargoon then enters and goes to tell the king some news, which, due to his mannerisms, shocks the king, causing him to buzz out and fling the enemy sales catalog he's reading into the air. Dedede tells the sniveling snail that he better be quiet as he'll bother his new pets, and the book falls upon Escargoon. Escargoon then shows the king his concern as he pulls out a calculator that displays the cost of the combined feeding, care requirements, and other experiences of the Scarfies, which mortifies him. It gets worse when he says that's just for one, and then adds all the other costs, requirements, and they quickly realize that these Scarfies are going to eat them into the poorhouse. The king immediately loses his affection for them and decides to get rid of them instead of just returning them or admitting that he was wrong. Indeed, despite being easily able to return them, the king decides instead to drive out into Wispy Woods. Now, this is the first episode to use Wispy Woods as a setting without actually having the appearance of Wispy Woods himself, and I think that's nice because it makes the world feel a lot bigger. It implies that Wispy Woods is an actual place and not just an individual who rules a certain area. We then see them driving through the area, and Escargoon says that he told the king so, and the king admits he was wrong before throwing the switch that causes a robotic hand to toss the Scarfies away. The English dub seems to have made this scene slightly shorter, yet not really in a noticeable or frankly even negative way. Scarfies, confused, exit the bag, but the king and Escargoon leave them to their fate. We see them afraid as we then transition to see Rick the Australian hamster wandering in the nearby area, holding an apple. He comes across the Scarfies, who, out of genuine interest and concern for these new inhabitants, offers them an apple. One takes a bite, but is disgusted by it. I assume that's because it's mostly a carnivore. And Rick says they must be picky, and they meow at him, and Rick apologizes, saying that all he has is the apple. The Scarfies, however, are not satisfied and then chase after Rick, trying to consume him alive. He climbs a tree to escape as the Scarfies lunge at him. We then cut to the sheep relaxing in their meadows, But then they become awakened when they see the Cappy's glowing cat-like eyes, as they are then consumed alive. The shepherd runs out to investigate all the horrible noises, and man, we just see piles of bones. He laments this loss and says he's got to report this to the mayor, as he sees the Scarfies now far more numerous in number, implying they either had sex or reproduced by budding. The shepherd bemoans on how they could do this, as we then cut to Kirby's house, where we see him sleeping in the nest. One of the Scarfies passing by notices him and remembers that he had tasted his flesh before, and they surround him, and eventually, after the clouds cover the moon, they climb the tree and bite him, which causes Kirby to scream in a combination of fear and pain. He then runs into his home, which awakens the wretched bird Takori, who is then eaten alive by one of the Scarfies, which is just amazing to see. Kirby manages to escape the bite of the Scarfy and then runs out of his house. Sadly, for whatever reason, Scarfy decides to spit out Takori, thus sparing him from a well-earned demise, which Takori then proceeds to complain about being spared a completely justified death. Truly, Takori, you are horrible. Kirby then flees from the Scarface as we see Mayor and the Shepherd comment on how he hopes that Kirby doesn't get treated the same way as his long-lost sheep. And the morning breaks. We cut to Kawasaki's restaurant where we see the chef discussing the recent killings of sheep with Melman the mailman, when suddenly they look as they hear the Scarface chase Kirby into the restaurant. The Scarfies float around the conversating pair as we then see the Japanese original Kirby fleeing into Samo's bar. We see the bartender save his love Mabel as the Scarfies cause chaos, destroying tons of what is likely very expensive wine and beer. 4Kids removed this for the reasons of not wanting kids to see references to illicit substances, which as someone who opposes censorship is clearly rather unnecessary and honestly these days seems kinda quaint to be perfectly honest. Kirby then flees into the grocery store, which causes Tuggle great concern, and the Scarfies all mindlessly consume his products. As we then cut to outside, where Cappy Town residents and Kirby are fleeing from the Scarfies as Kirby heads towards the castle, followed closely behind by the horde of invasive species. We see the king say that Takori is insane, as only 4 Scarfies exist, but Takori says there's at least 20. Probably more at this point. Escargoon says that the pack must have increased, to which the king says, oh well, it's not his problem, and the two laugh it off. Tiff, however, runs up to the king and calls him out for his irresponsible treatment of his pets. The king, however, shirks responsibility and says it's Escargoon's idea, trying to lay the blame on him, and that he never liked the pets. But Tiff calls him out, saying that he couldn't handle the Scarfies, and so let them loose to cause havoc. Tuff goes further, saying he couldn't afford the food bill. Escargoon chastises the boy for his accurate guess, and the king says they got tons of food, specially made for Scarfies, laughing in arrogance. Their laughter, however, is cut short by the sound of Mexico as Meta Knight tells them that they're coming. We see the Scarfies chasing Kirby into the castle. They then start chasing Tiff, Tuff, Dedede, and Escargoon through the halls. Eventually, though, Kirby the King and Escargoon get cornered by the Scarfies inside the throne room, where all the food is. Tiff and Tuff enter into the room shortly afterwards, and Tiff asks what are they waiting for, with Tuff yelling at them to give him the food. Dedede hesitantly laughs, and then he and Escargoon begin distributing this enemy-branded food, which looks like literal bones. The Scarfies greedily consume the food, and Dedede gloats about how great of a pet owner he is, but then Tuff points out that something horrifying is happening. Yeah, the Scarfies become horrific-looking cyclopean monsters, which, to be fair, is true to the game design, and honestly, I think they made the transition well, this more demonic form, and the transition state is just creepy. Escargoon and Dedede are appalled as we see yet more of them become monsters to the chagrin of Tiff and the others. They then become fixated on Kirby again and chase after him, and King Dedede asks what's going on, to which Tiff says something is wrong with the food, and Tuff points out the obvious, that it turned them into monsters, and they follow after him. So does Meta Knight, who admits that he should have known it was enemy, showing he's not all-knowing. We see Dedede and Escargoon getting gnawed on by the Scarfies, and they flee chased by them. We then see Tiff, Tuff, Kirby, the King, and Escargoon chased by them. The Waddle Dees try to fight numbers with numbers, but even they are pushed back. Sword Knight, Blade Knight also try to fight them, but Cerebrum and Ladylike just ask what they are before getting covered by them, not even trying to fight. Tiff sees this and tells Kirby to inhale. He does so, and, sadly, nothing happens. Yeah, apparently Kirby can't inhale Scarfies. Now, I must admit, this is a reference to the games where they can't be inhaled. But the thing is, in a gameplay sense, it actually is pretty enjoyable that they can't be inhaled and just increases variety in the games. But in the context of the anime, it doesn't really work. Up to this point, most things that Kirby can't inhale make sense, as they're super big. Meta Knight was somewhat of an edge case, but hey, at least he was slightly taller than Kirby, and wears heavy armor, so you could make an argument. But these guys are, if anything, slightly smaller than Kirby, and he can't inhale them for whatever reason. It's like they just turn off gravity for a moment. It's just like, why? And no, the statement that Meta Knight makes that Kirby can't inhale certain creatures is not a sufficient explanation. If anything, it just makes the problem more obvious. And even if you want to make the argument that, oh, well, maybe it's just something that the anime does that all enemies that Kirby normally can't inhale, he can just not inhale. As in episode 84, Mummy's Madness, which I'll eventually get to reviewing, Kirby can inhale the similarly sized entity, Mummy, even though in the games those can't be inhaled. So yeah, this is just dumb. And I think it's the only time that sticking close to the games for fan service actually hurt an episode, but you could say it's not that big of a deal, but it's just noticeable. In the end, Tuff asks Meta Knight if Kirby can't inhale them, how can they possibly beat the Scarfies? And Kirby eventually gets tired of sucking and is bitten by the Scarfies, which luckily Meta Knight bats away, and so everyone flees. They eventually come to a balcony where they see the king is cornered by his pets. He swings his hammer to keep them back. One lunges at him and gets luckily hit by the king's hammer, which knocks the treat out of its gut, even though shouldn't it be a pile of mush, or I don't know. Tiff notices this and with Meta Knight's suggestion tells Kirby to suck up Dedede's hammer. He walks up to the petty tyrant who demands his help. Kirby then starts sucking, and the king doesn't seem to understand and puts up a bit of a fight, which leads to him falling off the balcony. And Kirby smiles and eventually becomes... Ah, yes, this is a new copy ability, Hammer. Now, this ability was one of the first, seen all the way back in Kirby's Adventure, released back in 1993, which I've recently reviewed, so check that video out if interested. In Kirby's Nightmare in Dreamland, it was given a blue and white headband, as well as a more refined hammer appearance. The anime took that basic design but made some minor alterations. First, his headband is now all white instead of alternating blue and white, and the stars on each end of his hammer are red with a green background. Overall, I think it's an excellent redesign of a classic ability that maintains its base traits while having its own flair and own aesthetics. Meta Knight says the obvious after Tuff asks what that is, and the Scarfies surround Kirby and attack him. It is here that we see the last two changes between versions. The initial scene of Kirby doing a hammer bash attack is a bit more drawn out in the Japanese original, and 4Kids shortened it, and I think it made the fight more snappy, so it's one of those cases where a removed scene was actually better when it was removed, so yeah. Also, in the Japanese original, Kirby calls out the names of all its attacks, which 4Kids saw fit to remove, and honestly, that's a genuinely good decision, as the less Kirby talks, the better. He slams the Scarfies, which then spit out the food. We see the king trying not to fall and reclaim his balance, while Escargoon clings onto him. Kirby then does a giant swing to hit a bunch more Scarfies. Soon, however, all but one are normal. This last one charges at Kirby, who then uses a great wheel which sends the poor creature flying into the air, eventually falling into the king and Escargoon, who just managed to reach the top, leaving them in a giant crater as the Scarfy is turned back to normal. We then cut to the throne room where the king pleads with the enemy sales guy to take all the Scarfies back. The sales guy explains that they have a no return policy once they multiply, but says they can take them back if they work out something. The king asks what this workout would be, and the sales guy says they'll take it back for $1,000 for each Scarfy not originally sent. This causes the king to laugh a bit before breaking down crying as he fully reconciles how expensive it is, as we see the hordes of cat-like Scarfies cover the king and Escargoon as they complain about their current status. We see Tiff, Tuff, and Kirby watching the whole scene, laughing at it, until a Scarfy goes over and bites Kirby, and the episode ends with Kirby upset at that. Now that we've covered the episode's plot, let's talk about the positives, negatives, and my final thoughts. Starting with the positives, I just want to commend the theme of this episode. So a lot of episodes in this series, of course, they explore the environment, and some have considered that repetitive, but I think this episode managed to avoid repetition by doing a relatively underexplored theme involving the problems of the pet trade on both ecosystems as well as invasive species as a whole. Another positive is that King Dedede really reflects the traits of all bad pet owners really well. He doesn't take into account how much they cost, he spoils them rotten, only really loving them in a superficial enjoyment manner without really caring about the creatures at all, and he tosses them once they are no longer wanted or become too much of a burden. This happens a lot, especially by shitty people who only care about recording videos with them and not actually taking good care of them, and is seen in such infamous cases as the Burmese pythons. There's also the problem of invasive species, which upset the natural balance. More well-known cases include, cane toads in Australia, the gypsy moths in the northeast of the United States, and even cats are beings of pure evil that annually kill 2 billion birds in the U.S. Plus, all of the side characters like Kawasaki and Tiff were also well utilized. Seeing a new copy ability was neat, and I love Hammer as an ability, so that's really good to see, and frankly, I think that it was well utilized beating up Scarfies, even if the ability itself doesn't have quite the variety of moves as other copy abilities. Speaking of, the Scarfies really stand out. Not only is it neat to see an actual game enemy that in terms of design is iconic, it really made the transition to animation well, and alongside King Dedede really carries the theme. You get a feeling that these guys are really invasive and that they need very specialized care. However, as I said before, the fact that they can't be inhaled honestly just makes no sense in the context of the show and is one of the main negatives of the episode. Going on to some of the more negatives, another issue I had, though not as severe, was some of the censorship, especially of the music, which just goes to show how incompetent 4Kids, and the bar scene, which is honestly just childish and incompetent. I mean, seriously, 4Kids already know what these substances are, especially in this day and age. It just reeks of that nimby-pimby moral policing of the 1990s. Overall, those scarce minor criticisms aside, I genuinely consider this a good episode with a lot of neat moments. It's not the best, but it's really wholesome, especially some of the scenes with the king and Scarfies. I'd recommend giving it a watch, especially if you're binging the whole series. I'm the Dark Master, and if you like this video, consider subscribing and leaving a comment. And join me next time on the Kirby Right Back at Ya Retrospective. Have a wonderful day and take care.